This is 8 Minutes, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. There are over 10,000 offshore wind turbines installed in the seas off of Europe and Asia. But here in the US, only 81 turbines. So what gives? At the end of 2019, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory indicated that over 25,000 megawatts of offshore generating capacity was in the development pipeline for the US. What happened? Over the past couple of years, we've had projects in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Connecticut renegotiate or even outright cancel their contracts due to the headwinds in the industry. Today, let's dig into the near-term challenges of building a U.S. offshore wind industry and what the current state of affairs for this generating source truly is like. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's rays to hit Earth, or, well, for those of you who were able to experience the aurora borealis over the past weekend, it takes a bit longer for the solar particles from the coronal mass ejections to make their way to our planet. About 2 days, which would be a really long podcast. Let's get it on. The U.S. had 2 offshore wind farms completed at the end of 2023. Vineyard Wind, a cluster of 62 turbines, has already begun sending power to the New England grid, and South Fork Wind is expected to be commissioned soon to do the same. Offshore wind is a big part of the decarbonization strategy for northeastern states. I did an episode last year on the basics of the technology, but the general takeaway is that offshore wind is one of the few renewable resources that acts kind of like base-loaded power, able to deliver a consistent generating profile at all times of the day. And so, offshore wind has been really pushed by state and federal entities as a viable solution for decarbonizing electricity. The IRA included tax incentives for the projects, and individual states subsidized these projects by agreeing to purchase power from them at an elevated price point. Those power contracts are super important to development efforts. Without the guarantee that the project will be able to sell the power at a set price, the developer wouldn't be able to get the financing to construct the project in the first place. So because of that, a lot of projects signed power purchase agreements in 2018 and 2019 with the expectation of using those contracts to secure financing and build their projects. And then COVID hit and turned the industry upside down. Supply chain issues hit, and all of a sudden costs for basic materials like copper and steel were spiraling upwards. But even worse, interest rates began to increase. In 2019, the interbank rate was around 2%, but by 2023, that had jumped to 5% and had increased the cost for these projects by billions of dollars. Those pre-negotiated power purchase agreements, even with the original premiums agreed to by the states, just weren't enough to make these projects happen anymore. And some projects, such as the aforementioned Vineyard Wind and South Fork projects, were far enough along to where they could continue to be built, but others, with commercial operating dates further out, weren't so lucky. Commonwealth Wind, a project being developed by Avangrid, asked Massachusetts to reopen their agreement in 2022 before pulling completely out of the contract in December of that year. Park City Wind voided their contract with Connecticut in October of 2023, and New Jersey swallowed hard and agreed to a $2 per ratepayer increase to further subsidize a project by Ørsted. And then New York roiled the industry by denying requests from 4 separate offshore wind projects to reopen their contracts. Instead, the state decided to reopen the competitive process and determine whether those projects were truly still in the best interest of New Yorkers. That process completed in February of this year, when 2 projects, Sunrise Wind and Empire Wind 1, were reselected by the state. Those new contracts, though, are pricey. In 2019, the power prices negotiated for those projects averaged out at around $83 per megawatt hour. Today, that same power is being agreed to at around $150 a megawatt hour. These issues have cascaded across other areas of the U.S. where offshore wind was expected to play a big role too. The Gulf of Mexico held an auction last year for the lease rights to 3 separate areas, but only ended up getting bids on one of them. Developers are nervous. Part of the problem is the long lead time to get these projects developed in the first place. An owner needs to secure that aforementioned lease right, engineer out the potential project, secure turbine contracts, ensure the PPA agreement with the state, go through permitting, processing, financing. In the US, that process can take 6 or more years, even though in other countries, the development timeline can be much, much quicker. And with that long cycle, there are more things that can go wrong. Higher inflation and interest rates apparently among them. But despite all of that, offshore wind remains a key component of the energy transition. There's still thousands of megawatts of capacity in the pipeline to be developed, and despite the challenges I mentioned for the Gulf, a recent auction in California, 5 lease areas was wildly successful, demonstrative of strong demand and appetite for these projects. And costs will come down as we develop the expertise on how offshore wind can be deployed. The things that the industry and states need to do to better manage risk are not difficult to understand, though. First, the risk of interest rate increases should be hedged through financial instruments, not through an expectation of increasing a PPA price along the way. Basically, offshore wind developers believe that the long period of low interest rates that we had been experiencing up to 2019 was just going to continue, and our financial hygiene was lacking. But even inflation, that should be hedged properly as well. Insurers now have products that can actually protect against the rising costs of copper and steel, protecting both the developer as well as the ratepayer. And states and their electric utilities need to look hard at the offtake agreements for these projects. What happens if interest rates decline in the near future or steel prices drop? How do those cost decreases pass back through to the ratepayers? Looking forward, it's obvious that the hyperbolic forecasts of 2018 and 2019 of offshore wind growth will be delayed. And there will be a lot of pushback on these increased costs as the public digests what this means for them. But the takeaway is that the offshore wind projects are still getting developed. They're still a big part of a decarbonized future. It's just that we had best learn the lessons from the past few years before getting too crazy with our expectations. I'm Paul Schuster, and this has been your 8 Minutes.